The autumn leaves danced outside Eleanor Morrison's kitchen window as she carefully folded the last dinner napkin, her arthritic fingers moving with practiced precision despite the pain. At 78, she had learned to work around her limitations, though the wheelchair had become a constant reminder of how much her world had shrunk since the stroke 3 years ago. Marcus should be here any minute, she murmured to herself, glancing at the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Her son had promised to pick her up for her granddaughter Sophie's birthday party. Milestone 18th birthday that Eleanor wouldn't miss for the world. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock. Marcus stood on her doorstep checking his phone with obvious impatience. His BMW idled in the driveway, engine running like he couldn't wait to leave. "Ready, Mom?" he asked without looking up, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed irritation that had become his default. When speaking to her, Eleanor's heart sank a little, but she forced a smile. "Almost, dear. I just need to get my purse from the kitchen table. Can't you get it yourself?" "I'm already running late," Marcus replied, still focused on his phone screen. "Traffic's going to be murder, and Linda's expecting us by 4. Eleanor wheeled herself to the kitchen, her shoulders sagging. She remembered when Marcus used to light up at the sight of her, when he'd run into her arms after school with stories, and scraped knees that needed kissing better. Now, at 45, her successful real estate attorney's son seemed to view her as nothing more than an inconvenience. She retrieved her purse and wheeled back to find Marcus tapping his foot by the door. Finally, he muttered under his breath. Though not quietly enough, the ride to Linda's house in the upscale suburb of Westfield was conducted in near silence. Marcus drove with aggressive precision, weaving through traffic while taking calls through his Bluetooth headset about property, closings, and client meetings. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat watching the familiar neighborhoods of Springfield, Massachusetts, blur past through the rain-streaked window. "Marcus," she said during a brief pause between his calls, "I was thinking we could have lunch next week, just the two of us. There's this new cafe downtown that Mom..." "Not now," he cut her off as his phone rang again. "Hello, this is Marcus Morrison." Eleanor turned back to the window, swallowing the words that had died in her throat. The rain was getting heavier, now, drumming against the glass like tears she refused to shed. They pulled into Linda's circular driveway, where cars were already lined up along the street. Through the large windows, Eleanor could see the warm glow of the party inside, family members laughing, children running around the life she desperately wanted to be part of. Marcus parked and immediately got out, heading toward the trunk. Eleanor waited, assuming he would come around to help her with her wheelchair as he always did. But minutes passed and she heard the trunk slam shut. She turned to see Marcus walking toward the house, carrying the wrapped gift they'd brought. "For Sophie." "Marcus," she called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. He stopped and turned back, his expression one of annoyed confusion. "What? My wheelchair?" Eleanor said, pointing toward the trunk. "I can't get it out myself." Marcus glanced at his watch, then at the house where the party was in full swing. "Can't you just use your walker? It's in the back seat." Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation. "Marcus, you know I can't walk that far," the doctor said. "Fine," he interrupted, jogging back with obvious reluctance. He yanked the wheelchair from the trunk with more force than necessary, unfolding it beside her door. But as Eleanor began to transfer herself from the car seat, Marcus was already looking toward the house again. "Hurry up, Mom. Everyone's already..." Inside, Eleanor's movements were slower than usual, made clumsy by the rain and her son's impatience. Finally settled in her wheelchair, she looked up at Marcus expectantly. This was always the part where he would take the handles and push her where she needed to go. But Marcus was already walking away again. "Marcus." Eleanor called out, confused. He stopped and turned back one more time, his face twisted with something that looked almost like disgust. "What now? Could you push me to the door? The driveway is uneven, and with the rain, .. Marcus looked around the neighborhood as if checking to see who might be watching. A few of Linda's neighbors were visible through their windows, and a couple was walking their dog down the sidewalk. "Mom, I can't be seen pushing you around like some kind of... Just use your arms. That's what the wheels are for." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of his embarrassment over her. His own mother settled into her chest like a stone. I don't understand," she whispered. Marcus ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it disheveled. "Look, I've got a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood. Linda's friends are here, business contacts. I can't have them seeing me as the guy who has to take care of his disabled mother. It's not a good look." Eleanor sat in her wheelchair in the rain, staring at her son, this stranger who had somehow replaced the little boy she'd raised, the young man she'd been so proud of. The rain was soaking through her coat now, but she barely felt it. "A good look," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know what I mean?" Marcus said, his tone defensive now. "I've worked hard to build my practice, to establish myself in this community. I can't afford to look weak or burdened." Burdened. The word echoed in Eleanor's mind as she watched her son turn and walk into the house without another glance back. She sat there for a long moment, rain dripping from her gray hair, onto her hands folded in her lap. Slowly, painfully, Eleanor began to push herself across the uneven driveway. The wheels of her chair caught in the gravel, and twice she nearly tipped over. Her arms burned with the effort, and her clothes were soaked through by the time she reached the front steps. The steps. She stared up at them, realizing with growing horror that there was no ramp. She would have to ask someone inside to help her, to carry her up like a piece of furniture while everyone watched. Through the window, she could see Sophie opening presents, surrounded by cousins and friends. Marcus stood near the back of the room, drink in hand, laughing at something Linda's husband had said. He looked relaxed, happy, even happier than he'd looked around Eleanor in years. She sat there for another 10 minutes, gathering the courage to ring the doorbell and face the inevitable awkwardness of needing help. But as she reached for the button, she heard Marcus's voice from inside, clearer now as someone had opened a window. Double quotes, ... "Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. She's becoming more demanding every day, always wanting attention, always needing something. It's exhausting." Eleanor's hand froze halfway to the doorbell. "That's rough, man," came another voice she recognized as Linda's brother, Tom. "Have you thought about, a facility? My uncle's in one of those assisted living places, and he loves it." "I've been looking into it," Marcus replied. "There's this place about an hour outside the city. Nothing fancy, but it would take care of the problem. She's got enough savings to cover it for a few years, and after that, ... His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Eleanor felt something break inside her chestnut, her heart, which had been cracking for years, but something deeper. Her resolve, perhaps. Or maybe just the last of her illusions about the son she'd sacrificed everything to raise. She turned her wheelchair around and began the slow, painful journey back across the driveway. This time, she didn't care about the rain or the gravel, or the burning in her arms. She had a sudden, crystal-clear understanding of what she needed to do. By the time Marcus came looking for her an hour later, probably only because Linda had asked where she was, Eleanor was gone, she'd called a taxi and left a note on his windshield. "Don't worry about taking me home. I'll find my own way." That night, alone in her small house, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a yellow legal pad. For the first time in years, she had a plan, and for the first time since her stroke, she felt truly powerful. The following morning brought an unusual energy to Eleanor's typically quiet routine. She woke before dawn, her mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been for months. The humiliation of the previous day had crystallized into something harder and more purposeful. Determination. Eleanor wheeled herself to her home office, a small room that had once been Marcus's childhood bedroom. The walls still held faded marks where his baseball posters had hung, ghostly reminders of better times. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Important Documents and spread its contents across the desk. Her will, written 5 years ago with Marcus as the primary beneficiary, stared back at her. The house, the savings account, the small but valuable collection of her late husband Robert's antique books, the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, all of it designated to pass to a son who viewed her as a burden to be hidden away. Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed the number for Peterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Robert's estate. "Peterson and Associates, this is Jennifer speaking." "Hello, Jennifer. This is Eleanor Morrison. I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Peterson regarding my will. It's urgent." "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Let me check his calendar. Would Thursday at 2 o'clock work for you?" Eleanor glanced at her own calendar, marked with the usual sparse appointments, doctor visits, grocery deliveries, the occasional call from Sophie. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to steel herself for what she was about to do. "That would be perfect," Eleanor said. "And Jennifer, I'll need to discuss changing my will completely, starting from scratch." After hanging up, Eleanor spent the morning researching her old laptop, a gift from Marcus from several Christmases. A go wheezed to life as she navigated to websites about elder care, family law, and charitable organizations. She took notes in her careful handwriting, building a case not just for her lawyer, but for herself. The doorbell rang at 11. Eleanor wheeled to the front door to find Sophie standing on the porch, her young face creased with concern. Even at 18, she still had the earnest eyes of the little girl who used to spend summers at Eleanor's house, helping in the garden and listening to stories about her grandfather. Grandma Ellie, Dad said you left the party early yesterday. Are you okay? Eleanor's heart swelled. Of all her family members, Sophie was the only one who still called regularly, who remembered her birthday, who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. She was also, Eleanor realized, old enough now to understand the truth. Come in, sweetheart, I'll make us some tea. They sat in Eleanor's living room, where photographs chronicled decades of family history. Sophie curled up in the old armchair. That had been her favorite spot as a child, while Eleanor poured tea from her good china set. Sophie, Eleanor began carefully. What did your father tell you about why I left yesterday? Sophie shifted uncomfortably. He said you weren't feeling well, that you got overwhelmed by all the people and needed to go home and rest. Eleanor nodded slowly. And what do you think about that explanation? Honestly, Sophie's voice was quiet. I think there's more to it. Dad seemed different after you left. Relieved, maybe. And when Aunt Linda asked where you were, he just brushed it off like it didn't matter. Eleanor felt a surge of validation. Even at 18, Sophie could see what Eleanor had been experiencing for years, the gradual erosion of Marcus's affection. The way he'd begun to treat her presence as an inconvenience rather than a gift. Sophie, I want to tell you what really happened yesterday. But first, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll listen with an open mind and that you'll think carefully about what I tell you. Your father is still your father, but you're old enough now to see him as a complete person with flaws as well as strengths. Sophie nodded solemnly. I promise. Eleanor told her everything, the drive in silence, the refusal to help with the wheelchair, the cruel words about reputation and being seen as burdened. She told her about overhearing Marcus's conversation about assisted living facilities, about the way he'd spoken of her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved by the time she finished. Sophie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he was treating you like that. It's not your fault, sweetheart, and I don't want you to feel caught in the middle, but I do want you to understand why I'm about to make some changes, Eleanor explained. Her plan to revoke Marcus's inheritance, to redirect her assets to causes and people who would value them. She watched Sophie's face carefully, looking for signs of judgment or dismay, but found only thoughtful consideration. You know what Sophie said finally? I think you're doing the right thing. Dad has plenty of money from his law practice. He doesn't need yours. And if he can't even show you basic respect, ... She shook her head. Maybe this will wake him up. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Having Sophie's support meant more than she'd realized it would. There's something else, Eleanor continued. I want to make sure you're taken care of. Your father makes good money, but I know college is expensive, and you've talked about graduate school. Grandma, you don't have to. I want to. You're the only one who still sees me as a person worth knowing. Let me invest in your future. They spent the next hour discussing Eleanor's plans. Sophie would receive a substantial education fund, enough to cover both undergraduate and graduate studies without the burden of loans. The house would go to a local charity that provided housing for elderly individuals who wanted to age in place with dignity. The remainder of Eleanor's savings would be split between several organizations that served seniors and disabled individuals. What about Dad? Sophie asked. Are you going to tell him beforehand? Eleanor considered this. No, I think actions have consequences, and it's time Marcus learned that. He'll find out when the will is read. He's going to be furious. I'm sure he will be. But Sophie, I've spent the last 3 years trying to earn back his love and respect, diminishing myself to make him more comfortable. I'm done with that. I may be 78 and wheelchair-bound, but I'm still Eleanor Morrison. I raised that boy. I built a life I loved and was loved. I deserve better than to be treated like damaged goods. Sophie reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand. You do deserve better, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. That evening, after Sophie left, Eleanor sat in her kitchen making lists. Organizations to research, documents to gather, people to call. For the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her own story rather than simply enduring it. She thought about Marcus as a little boy, the way he used to climb into her lap when he had nightmares, how he'd bring her dandelions from the yard and call them sunshine flowers. Somewhere along the way, that loving child had been replaced by a cold, calculating man who saw relationships in terms of cost and benefit. Eleanor couldn't fix Marcus, but she could stop enabling his selfishness. She could stop pretending that unconditional love meant accepting unacceptable behavior. Most importantly, she could ensure that her legacy reflected her values rather than his entitlement. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her still bore the marks of yesterday's humiliation, the slight slump of her shoulders, the sadness around her eyes. But there was something new there too. Something that hadn't been present in years. Strength, purpose, the quiet confidence of someone who had finally remembered her own worth. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of October in New England. Eleanor had been awake since 5, her mind running through the conversation she would have with her lawyer, the documents she would need to sign, the point of no return she was about to cross. She dressed with unusual care, choosing her best navy dress and the pearl earrings Robert had given her for their silver anniversary. If she was going to reclaim her dignity, she would do it properly. The taxi arrived at exactly 1:30. Eleanor had specifically chosen not to ask Marcus for a ride, though she knew he would offer if she called not out of care, but out of the controlling need to know what she was doing. This was her mission, and she would complete it on her own terms. Peterson and Associates occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Springfield. Eleanor had been there once before when Robert died, but the elevator had been broken then, and Marcus had carried her up the stairs. Today, she was relieved to see it was working properly. Harold Peterson was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had helped many families navigate difficult transitions. He greeted Eleanor warmly, settling her into a comfortable chair across from his mahogany desk. "Mrs. Morrison, it's good to see you again, though I'm sorry it's under circumstances that require changing your will." Jennifer mentioned this was urgent. Eleanor had rehearsed this moment, but sitting here now, the full weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her. She took a steadying breath. "Mr. Peterson, I need to completely revoke my current will and create a new one. I want to remove my son Marcus as my primary beneficiary and redistribute my assets to other parties." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "I see. Mrs. Morrison, changes of this magnitude are certainly your right to make, but I do have an obligation to ensure you're making this decision with full awareness of the implications. May I ask what has prompted this change?" Eleanor told him everything. The years of increasing coldness, the missed visits, the way Marcus spoke about her when he thought she couldn't hear. She described the incident at Sophie's party in detail, watching Harold's expression grow more grave as she continued. "I see," Harold said when she finished. "Mrs. Morrison, what you're describing sounds like a pattern of emotional neglect and, frankly, elder abuse. Have you considered reporting this to Adult Protective Services?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't want to destroy my son's career or reputation. I just want to ensure that my assets go to people and causes that will appreciate them, rather than to someone who sees them as his due." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Very well, let's discuss your new directives." They spent the next 2 hours crafting Eleanor's new will. $25,000 would go to Sophie for her education. The house, valued at approximately $180,000, would be donated to the Western Massachusetts Senior Housing Initiative. Her savings account, containing nearly $90,000, would be split between 3 charities: the Alzheimer's Association, the local food bank, and a nonprofit that provided transportation services for disabled seniors. The pearl necklace, worth several $1,000s, would go to Sophie. Robert's book collection would go to the Springfield Public Library. The remainder of her possessions would be donated to various charitable organizations. Marcus would receive exactly $1, along with a letter explaining her decision. "Mrs. Morrison," Harold said as they reviewed the final draft, "I want to make sure you understand that this will undoubtedly cause significant family discord. Your son will likely contest it." Eleanor's voice was steady. "Let him try. I am of sound mind. I have clear reasons for my decisions, and I have the right to dispose of my property as I see fit. Marcus is a successful attorney. He doesn't need my money. What he needs is to learn that actions have consequences." Harold made notes on the document. "I'll need 2 witnesses for the signing. Let me call in my assistant and our paralegal." As they waited for the witnesses, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. This was the most decisive action she'd taken since Robert's death, the first time in years she'd felt truly in control of her own life. Jennifer and the paralegal, a young man named David, entered the office. Harold explained that they were witnessing the signing of a will, and both confirmed that Eleanor appeared to be of sound mind and acting of her own free will. Eleanor signed her name with firm, clear strokes. As the ink dried on the paper, she felt something shift inside her, a door closing on one phase of her life and opening to another. "Mrs. Morrison," Harold said as he sealed the documents, "I need to ask one more time, are you certain you don't want to discuss this with your son first? Give him a chance to change his behavior." Eleanor considered this. Part of Hertha, part that remembered teaching Marcus to ride a bike, nursing him through chickenpox, cheering at his high school graduation, wanted to believe he could change, but a larger part of her knew better. Mr. Peterson, I've spent 3 years trying to earn back my son's love and respect. I've made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that would make me easier for him to tolerate. Yesterday, he made it clear that even that isn't enough. He's ashamed of me. He sees me as a burden. He's already planning to put me in a facility and forget about me. She paused, looking out the window at the busy street below, where people were going about their lives with purpose and dignity. I refuse to spend whatever time I have left begging for scraps of affection from someone who should love me unconditionally. I raised Marcus to be better than this. If he chooses not to be, that's his decision, but I won't reward it with my inheritance. Harold nodded. I understand. The documents will be filed and copies will be kept in our secure files. Is there anything else you need today? Eleanor thought for a moment. Yes. I'd like you to prepare a letter to be delivered to Marcus after my death, along with a will. I want him to understand exactly why I made this decision. They spent another 30 minutes crafting the letter. Eleanor's words were firm but not cruel, disappointed but not vindictive. She explained her decision, expressed her hope that he would use this wake-up call to examine his treatment of others, and told him that despite everything, she would always love the little boy he had been. As Eleanor waited for her taxi outside the law office, she called Sophie. Grandma, how did it go? It's done, Eleanor said. I feel lighter somehow, like I've been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there. I'm proud of you, Sophie said. It took courage to do what you did. Eleanor smiled. Sophie, I want you to know that whatever happens next, you've been the bright spot in these difficult years. Your love and respect have meant everything to me. I love you too, Grandma. Are you going to tell Dad what you did? Eleanor watched traffic pass on the busy street. Ordinary people living their ordinary lives, most of them probably taking for granted the basic respect and love that she'd been denied. No, she said finally. He'll find out when he needs to. For now, I'm going to focus on living my life with dignity on my own terms. That night, Eleanor sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea and her photo albums. She turned the pages slowly, watching Marcus grow from a chubby-cheeked baby to a serious young man in graduation photos. Somewhere in between was the point where things had changed, where love had been replaced by obligation, and obligation by resentment. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but she knew it didn't matter now. She had drawn her line in the sand. She had reclaimed her power. Whatever came next, she would face it as Eleanor Morrison, not as Marcus's burden, not as anyone's problem to be solved, but as a woman of worth and dignity who had finally remembered how to stand up for herself, even if she had to do it from a wheelchair. 3 weeks after Eleanor signed her new will, she received a phone call that would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Morrison, this is Janet Collins from Sunset Manor Assisted Living. Your son Marcus has asked us to schedule a tour for you next Tuesday at 10 a.m. He mentioned you might be interested in our facilities. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white against the black plastic. I'm sorry, Miss Collins, but there must be some mistake. I haven't expressed any interest in assisted living facilities. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, well, your son seemed quite certain that you were ready to make this transition. He's already submitted preliminary paperwork and paid the application fee. Perhaps you could discuss this with him and call us back. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in her kitchen, shaking with a mixture of rage and betrayal. Marcus was moving forward with his plan without even consulting her. The application fee meant he was serious. This wasn't just idle conversation at a party. He was actively trying to remove her from her home, from her independence, from everything she had left. She called Sophie immediately. He did what? Sophie's voice was sharp with disbelief. Grandma, he can't just put you in a home without your consent. That's not how it works. Apparently he thinks it is how it works, Eleanor replied. Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Has your father said anything to you about this? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Actually, yes. Last week he asked me what I thought about you living in a more appropriate setting. He said you were becoming too difficult to manage, that you needed more care than he could provide. I told him that seemed extreme, that you're doing fine on your own. Eleanor felt the last of her doubts about changing her will evaporate. What did he say to that? He said I didn't understand the full situation, that there were things about your health and mental state that I wasn't aware of. He made it sound like you were declining more than you actually are. The picture was becoming clearer now. Marcus wasn't just planning to put her in a facility, he was building a case for why it was necessary, probably to avoid looking like the villain when he did it. Sophie, I need your help with something. It might be uncomfortable for you. Anything. Grandma, what do you need? I need you to be my witness. I want to confront your father directly about this, and I want someone there who can verify what happens. Will you do that? Sophie didn't hesitate, of course. When tonight? I'm going to call him and ask him to come over for dinner. I'm going to tell him I know about Sunset Manor, and I'm going to give him one last chance to explain himself. Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing. She cooked Marcus's favorite meal pot roast with vegetables, the same dinner she'd made for his birthday every year until he'd stopped coming to celebrate with her. She set the table with her good china and lit candles, creating an atmosphere of warmth and family that felt increasingly foreign in their relationship. Sophie arrived at 5:30, carrying a small recording device. Just in case, she explained. If things get ugly, it might be good to have proof of what was said. Marcus arrived at 6, looking surprised by the elaborate dinner setup. He'd clearly expected a quick, perfunctory visit, probably to discuss her transition to assisted living. Mom, you really didn't need to go to all this trouble, he said, though he seemed pleased by the effort. Nonsense, Eleanor replied, wheeling herself to the table. It's been too long since we had a proper family dinner. Sophie, would you help me serve? They ate in relative peace for the first 20 minutes, with Eleanor asking about Marcus's work and Sophie sharing stories about her senior year of high school. It felt almost normal, like the family dinners of years past. Eleanor found herself wondering if this was how it could be if Marcus could just remember how to love her without conditions. But she hadn't invited him here for nostalgia. Marcus, she said, as Sophie cleared the dinner plates, I received an interesting phone call today. Marcus looked up from his coffee cup, suddenly alert. Oh, from Sunset Manor Assisted Living? They wanted to schedule a tour for me. Apparently, someone has already submitted paperwork and paid an application fee on my behalf. The color drained from Marcus's face, but he recovered quickly, his lawyer's training kicking in. Mom, I can explain, I'm sure you can, Eleanor interrupted. I'm very interested to hear that explanation. Marcus glanced at Sophie, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in front of her. Sophie, maybe you should. Sophie stays, Eleanor said firmly. She's family, and she has a right to hear this. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, the same gesture he'd made as a child when caught in a lie. Look, Mom, I was just exploring options. You're getting older. You need more help. And I thought you'd make decisions about my life without consulting me. I was going to talk to you about it, Marcus said defensively. I just wanted to have all the information first. Eleanor studied her son's face, looking for any sign of the remorse or shame she hoped to find. Instead, she saw calculation, the same expression he probably wore when negotiating with opposing counsel. Marcus, let me ask you something directly. Do you want me to move to an assisted living facility? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I think it might be best for everyone. You'd have professional care activities with people your own age, meals prepared for you. That's not what I asked. Do you want me to move there? The silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus's composure cracked. Yes, he said quietly. I think you should. Why? Because ... Marcus struggled for words, then seemed to decide on honesty. Because I can't keep doing this, Mom. The constant worry, the phone calls, the guilt every time I don't visit often enough. It's affecting my work, my marriage, my entire life. You need more care than I can give you, and frankly, more care than I want to give you. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, not heartbreak this time, but a cold, clear certainty. This was who her son had become. This was the choice he was making. I see, she said calmly. And what if I told you I don't want to move? What if I told you I'm happy here, that I'm managing fine on my own, that this is my home and I intend to stay in it? Marcus's jaw tightened. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. You can't live alone indefinitely. What happens when you fall and no one finds you for days? What happens when you forget to take your medication or leave the stove on? I haven't forgotten my medication or left the stove on. I haven't fallen. Marcus, I had one stroke 3 years ago and I've recovered remarkably well. I use a wheelchair for mobility, but my mind is perfectly clear for now, Marcus said. But what about next year? What about when you're 80, 85? I can't be constantly worried about you. Eleanor looked at her son, really looked at him. Anne saw a stranger. The little boy who had once brought her dandelions was completely gone, replaced by this cold, self-interested man who spoke of her future decline as if it were inevitable and imminent. Marcus, she said quietly, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not moving to an assisted living facility. Not now, not next year, not ever unless it becomes medically necessary. This is my decision to make, not yours. Marcus's face flushed red. Mom, you're being unreasonable. I'm trying to do what's best for you. No, Eleanor said, her voice growing. Stronger, you're trying to do what's most convenient for you. There's a difference. That's not fair, Marcus snapped. I've been taking care of you for 3 years, taking care of me. Eleanor's voice rose. Marcus, when was the last time you helped me with groceries? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you pushed my wheelchair without complaining about it? Sophie watched the exchange with wide eyes, her phone recording everything. I drive you places, Marcus said defensively, when it's convenient for you. And last week at Sophie's party, you refused to push my wheelchair from the car to the door, because you were embarrassed to be seen with me. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I never said I was embarrassed. You said you couldn't afford to look weak or burdened. You said you had a reputation to maintain. You were embarrassed of your disabled mother, Marcus. Admit it. The truth hung in the air between them. Marcus looked around the room as if searching for an escape route. His lawyer's skills failing. Him in the face of his mother's unwavering honesty. Maybe I was, he said finally. Maybe I am embarrassed. Is that so wrong? I've worked hard to build my life, my practice, my reputation. I don't want people seeing me as someone who can't even take care of his own mother. Eleanor felt the last piece of her heart that still belonged to her son crumble away. So your solution is to hide me away where no one has to see me. It's not hiding. It is exactly hiding. Marcus. And what's worse, you've been planning it without my knowledge or consent? You've been telling people I'm declining mentally, preparing them for when you ship me off to an institution? Marcus's face went pale. How did you? It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that you've been lying about me, manipulating the situation to make your abandonment of me seem reasonable and necessary. I'm not abandoning you, Marcus protested weakly. Eleanor leveled him with a stare that had once been able to stop him in his tracks as a misbehaving child. Marcus, let me tell you what abandonment looks like. It looks like a son who visits his mother only when he needs something. It looks like refusing to help her with basic mobility because it might damage your image. It looks like planning to institutionalize her without her knowledge or consent. It looks like viewing your own mother as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I don't have to listen to this. You're being dramatic and manipulative, just like always. Sit down, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of motherhood. We're not finished. Actually, we are, Marcus said, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. I'm done being guilt-tripped and blamed for everything. I have my own life to live. Yes, you do, Eleanor agreed, and I have mine, which is why I need to tell you something important. Something in her tone made Marcus pause halfway to the door. I've changed my will. Marcus, you are no longer my beneficiary. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to expand outward in the silence that followed. Marcus turned around slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. What did you say? I said, I've changed my will. Everything I own this house, my savings, all of it will go to people and organizations that will appreciate it. You'll receive $1 and a letter explaining why. Marcus's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, and finally, rage. You can't do that, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I already have. The papers are signed and filed with Harold Peterson. It's done. You're not thinking clearly, Marcus said, stepping closer to her wheelchair. This proves you need to be in a facility. You're obviously having some kind of mental breakdown. Sophie stood up from her chair, her young face set with determination. Dad, stop. Grandma is thinking perfectly clearly. She's been thinking more clearly than you have for years. Marcus whirled on his daughter. Stay out of this, Sophie. This is between me and my mother. No, it's not, Sophie said firmly. It's about family, and I'm part of this family, and I've been watching you treat Grandma like garbage for months now. I have not. You have, Sophie interrupted. You complain about having to drive her anywhere. You act like spending time with her is a chore. You barely call her, and when you do visit, you're checking your watch the whole time. And last week you were so embarrassed by her wheelchair that you left her sitting in the rain. Marcus's face was red now, veins standing out on his forehead. I work 60 hours a week to provide for my family. I don't have unlimited time for socializing. This isn't socializing, Eleanor said quietly. This is loving your mother, something you seem to have forgotten how to do. I do love you, Marcus said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. No, Marcus. You love the idea of me, the convenient mother who stays quietly in the background, who doesn't need anything, who makes you look good. You don't love the real me, the woman who uses a wheelchair, who sometimes needs help, who wants to spend time with her son. Marcus began pacing the small kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. This is insane. You're punishing me for being practical, for thinking about the future? I'm responding to your actions, Marcus. For 3 years, you've shown me exactly how much I mean to you. Now I'm showing you what that means to me. So you're just going to throw away everything Dad worked for? Everything I'm entitled to? There it was, the word Eleanor had been waiting for. Entitled. You're not entitled to anything, Marcus. I don't owe you my inheritance just because you're my son. Inheritance is a gift, not a right, and gifts go to people who appreciate them. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at his mother with something approaching hatred. You're doing this to manipulate me. You think if you threaten to cut me off, I'll suddenly become the perfect son. Eleanor shook her head sadly. No, Marcus. I'm doing this because it's already too late for that. You've shown me who you are, and I believe you. This isn't manipulation, it's consequences. I'll contest it, Marcus said, his lawyer's mind finally engaging. I'll have you declared mentally incompetent. Any judge will see that this is the act of someone who isn't thinking clearly. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device identical to the one Sophie had brought. She placed it on the table between them. You mean a judge will see that a perfectly lucid 70-year-old woman made a rational decision to disinherit a son who planned to institutionalize her against her will? A son who admitted on tape that he's embarrassed by her disability? A son who views caring for his mother as an inconvenience to his reputation? Marcus stared at the device, his face going white as he realized the implications. You've been recording this conversation? We've been recording this conversation, Sophie said, holding up her own device, every word. Marcus looked back and forth between them, trapped by his own words. You set me up. No, Eleanor said. I gave you a chance to tell the truth, and you did. I'm grateful for that, actually. It makes what comes next much easier. What comes next? Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Now I get to live the rest of my life with dignity, surrounded by people who actually care about me. And you get to live with the knowledge that your selfishness and cruelty cost you everything your father worked to build. Marcus stood there, for a long moment, seeming to struggle with whether to continue fighting or to try a different approach. Finally, he chose a path that confirmed everything Eleanor had realized about him. Fine, he said coldly. Keep your money. I don't need it anyway. But don't expect me to come running when you fall and break your hip, or when you really do start losing your mind. You've made your choice now, you get to live with it. He headed for the door, then paused and looked back at Sophie. And you, I'm disappointed in you. I thought I raised you better than to turn against your own father. Sophie lifted her chin. Defiantly, you did raise me better, Dad. You raised me to stand up for what's right, to protect people who can't protect themselves, and to treat family with love and respect. I learned those lessons. I'm sorry you forgot them. Marcus slammed the door behind him so hard that the windows rattled in the silence that followed. Eleanor and Sophie sat looking at each other across the kitchen table, both of them processing. What had just happened? Grandma, Sophie said finally. Are you okay? Eleanor considered the question. Was she okay? Her son had just confirmed her worst fears about his character. He had threatened her, tried to intimidate her, and ultimately abandoned her just as she'd predicted he would. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The uncertainty was over. The pretending was finished. She knew exactly where she stood with Marcus, and more importantly, she knew exactly who she was, a woman of worth and dignity who refused to accept less than she deserved. You know what? Sophie, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I think I am okay. I think I'm better than okay. Sophie smiled, tears in her eyes. I'm proud of you, Grandma. What you did tonight took incredible courage. Eleanor reached across the table and took her granddaughter's hand. What we did tonight, sweetheart, I couldn't have done it without you. As they cleaned up the dinner dishes together, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced her son's true nature, had stood up for herself, and had emerged with her dignity intact. The little boy who had brought her dandelions was gone, but the woman who had raised him was still here, still strong, still worthy of love and respect. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. Over the following days, Eleanor threw herself into living. She called the senior center about volunteer opportunities. She researched local clubs and activities. She scheduled visits with old friends she hadn't seen in months. She even looked into adaptive driving programs, wondering if she might be able to regain some independence behind the wheel. Marcus didn't call. Sophie visited twice that week, and they spent hours talking about college plans, career dreams, and the future. Eleanor felt like she was getting to know her granddaughter as an adult for the first time, and she marveled at the thoughtful, compassionate young woman Sophie was becoming. On Sunday morning, Eleanor was reading the newspaper when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Marcus's name. For a moment, she considered not answering. Then curiosity got the better of her. "Hello, Marcus, Mom." His voice was strained, careful. I've been thinking about what happened. The other night, Eleanor waited, saying nothing. "I think maybe we both said some things we didn't mean," Marcus continued. "Maybe we could start over, try to work this out." Eleanor closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe that this was genuine remorse, that her son had truly reflected on his behavior and was ready to change. But a larger part of her part that had been disappointed too. Many times before recognized this for what it was, damage control. "Marcus," she said gently, "what exactly do you think we said that we didn't mean?" There was a pause. "Well, you were upset about the assisted living thing, and I may have handled that badly. How should you have handled it?" Another pause. "Longer this time. I should have talked to you first, I guess." Eleanor felt her heart sink. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about process, about the order in which things were done, not about the fundamental lack of respect and love. That had motivated his actions. "Marcus, do you remember what you said about being embarrassed by me, Mom? I was angry. People say things when they're angry, do they?" Sophie was angry too, but she didn't say anything cruel or hurtful. Anger doesn't create feelings. Marcus, it reveals them. Silence on the other end of the line. "I think," Eleanor continued, "that you're calling because someone, probably Linda, told you that disinheriting me over this was an overreaction, and you're hoping you can smooth things over and get back in my will." "That's not," Marcus started, then stopped. "Isn't it?" More silence. "Marcus, I want you to know that I will always love the little boy you used to be, but I can't keep pretending that little boy still exists. You've shown me repeatedly who you are now, and I believe you. This conversation doesn't change anything." "Mom, please." Eleanor hung up. She sat in her kitchen for a long time after that, mourning not just her relationship with Marcus, but the illusions she'd held about who he was. It was a necessary grief. She realized the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping for something that was never going to happen. But as the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found her sadness giving way to something else. Anticipation? For the first time in years, she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. And that felt like freedom. She was 78 years old. She used a wheelchair, and she had just disinherited her only child. By conventional standards, her life might be considered a tragedy, but Eleanor Morrison had never felt more powerful. 6 months later, the courthouse in downtown Springfield buzzed with its usual activity as Eleanor rolled through the metal detectors, Sophie beside her carrying a leather briefcase. It had been 6 months since Eleanor changed her will, and today she was here for a different kind of legal proceeding, one that would put the final seal on her new life. "Are you nervous, Grandma?" Sophie asked as they waited for the elevator. Eleanor considered the question. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I'm excited." The elevator carried them to the 3rd floor, where Harold Peterson was waiting outside Courtroom 3B. He greeted them with a warm smile and the slightly anxious air of a lawyer who believed in his clients' case but knew that courtrooms could be unpredictable. "Mrs. Morrison, Sophie, thank you for being here. Are you ready for this?" Eleanor nodded. "I've been ready for months." They entered the courtroom where Marcus was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his own attorney, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit. Marcus looked older than he had 6 months ago. Eleanor noticed thinner, with new lines around his eyes. He didn't look at her as she wheeled herself to the defendant's table. The case was Marcus Morrison v. Eleanor Morrison, and it was exactly what Eleanor had predicted. Marcus was attempting to have her declared mentally incompetent and her new will invalidated. He claimed that her decision to disinherit him was evidence of diminished capacity, that she had been manipulated or coerced, and that her previous will should be reinstated. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, called the court to order. Eleanor had researched the judge and knew she had a reputation for fairness and a particular intolerance for family members who tried to manipulate the legal system for financial gain. Marcus's attorney, Patricia Lowe, presented their case first. She painted a picture of an elderly woman in decline, isolated and bitter, who had made an irrational decision to punish her devoted son for trying to ensure her safety and well-being. "Your Honor," Lowe said, "my client has been nothing but caring and responsible in his treatment of his mother. When he recognized that she needed more care than he could provide, he researched appropriate facilities and tried to have a conversation with her about her options. Mrs. Morrison's response was to disinherit him. Entirely a decision so extreme and vindictive that it can only be explained by diminished mental capacity." Eleanor listened to this version of events with fascination. In Lowe's telling, Marcus was a devoted son who had been unfairly punished for his love and concern. The refusal to push her wheelchair became helping her maintain independence. The plan to institutionalize her became researching care options. His admission of embarrassment became a moment of frustration taken out of context. When Lowe finished, Judge Hendricks looked at Harold Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, your response?" Harold stood and addressed the court with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, this case is not about an elderly woman's diminished capacity. It's about a son's sense of entitlement to his mother's assets, and his inability to accept that actions have consequences." Harold presented Eleanor's case methodically. He played excerpts from the recorded conversation with Marcus, letting the man's own words reveal his character. He presented testimony from Eleanor's doctor confirming her mental competency. He showed bank records proving Eleanor's continued ability to manage her own finances. Most damaging to Marcus's case, Harold presented evidence of Marcus's actual behavior toward his mother, the missed visits, the complaints to friends and family about her being a burden, the secret application to Sunset Manor. "Your Honor," Harold concluded, "Mrs. Morrison made a rational decision based on her son's demonstrated treatment of her. She chose to leave her assets to people and organizations that would value them, rather than to someone who had repeatedly shown that he viewed her as an inconvenience to be hidden away." Judge Hendricks called Eleanor to testify. Eleanor had been dreading this moment, but as she wheeled herself to the witness stand, she felt calm and centered. This was her chance to speak her truth, and she intended to take full advantage of it. Under Harold's gentle questioning, Eleanor told her story clearly and without rancor. She described years of increasing coldness from Marcus, his obvious impatience with her needs, and the final humiliation at Sophie's birthday party. "Mrs. Morrison," Harold asked, "why did you decide to change your will?" Eleanor looked directly at Judge Hendricks as she answered, "Your Honor, I realized that I was enabling my son's poor treatment of me because I was afraid of losing him completely. But I had already lost him. The loving son I raised was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as a liability. I decided I would rather live with dignity and leave a legacy that reflected my values than continue to reward behavior that was hurtful and disrespectful." When Marcus's attorney cross-examined Eleanor, she tried to portray her as vindictive and manipulative. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you secretly recorded a private conversation with your son?" "I recorded a conversation in my own home." "Yes, without his knowledge or consent." "That's correct. I wanted to give him a chance to explain his actions honestly without the performance he usually puts on when he knows he's being judged." "So you trapped him?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Ms. Lowe, I gave my son every opportunity to show love, respect, and basic human decency toward his disabled mother. He chose not to take those opportunities. I didn't trap him, I simply documented who he really is." The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, but Eleanor remained unshakable. Every attack on her credibility only served to highlight the reasonableness of her decision. When Sophie was called to testify, she spoke with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who had witnessed years of dysfunction and finally found the courage to name it. "He's my father, and I love him," Sophie said. "But I've watched him treat my grandmother like she was something to be ashamed of. He would complain about having to spend time with her, act like her needs were unreasonable demands, and talk about her like she was a problem to be solved. My grandmother is one of the kindest, most intelligent people I know. She deserved better than that." Marcus took the stand in his own defense, and Eleanor found herself studying this man who had once been her little boy. He was polished and articulate, as she'd expected, but there was something desperate in his eyes under his own attorney's questioning. Marcus presented himself as a busy professional who had done his best to care for an increasingly difficult mother. He admitted to moments of frustration but denied any systematic mistreatment. But under Harold's cross-examination, the facade began to crack. "Mr. Morrison, you testified that you were simply exploring care options for your mother. Is it true that you submitted an application to Sunset Manor without her knowledge?" "I was gathering information, Mr. Morrison." "Yes. Or no. Did you submit an application and pay an application fee without your mother's knowledge or consent?" Marcus hesitated. "Yes. And is it true that you told friends at a party that your mother was becoming more demanding every day and that caring for her was exhausting?" "I may have said something like that, and when your mother needed help getting her wheelchair from your car to the front door of a house, you refused because you were concerned about your reputation." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not exactly how it happened." "How did it happen, Mr. Morrison?" I thought she could manage on her own in the rain, on an uneven gravel driveway, while you were worried about being seen." Marcus didn't answer. Harold pressed on. "Mr. Morrison, in the recorded conversation with your mother, you stated, and I quote, 'I can't be constantly worried about you.' Do you recall saying that?" "Yes. And you also said, 'I don't want people seeing me as someone who can't even take care of his own mother.' Is that correct?" "Yes." "So, to be clear, Your concern was not about your mother's well-being, but about how caring for her would make you look to others. Marcus's attorney objected, but the damage was done. His own words had convicted him. When all the testimony was complete, Judge Hendricks recessed for 30 minutes to consider her ruling. Eleanor spent the time in the hallway with Sophie and Harold, feeling strangely peaceful despite the gravity of the moment. "How do you think it went?" Sophie asked Harold. "I think your grandmother was magnificent," Harold replied. "She told the truth with dignity and clarity. That's all we can do." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Hendricks delivered her ruling with the authority of someone who had seen this type of family dysfunction many times before. This court finds that Mrs. Eleanor Morrison was fully competent when she executed her new will, and that her decision to disinherit her son was based on rational consideration of his treatment of her over a period of years. Eleanor felt her shoulders relax for the first time in months. Judge Hendricks continued, "The plaintiff has failed to provide credible evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence. Indeed, the evidence presented suggests that Mrs. Morrison's decision was not only rational but perhaps overdue. This court has seen too many cases where elderly parents are mistreated by adult children who feel entitled to their assets. Mrs. Morrison's decision to remove her son as a beneficiary appears to be a reasonable response to years of neglect and emotional abuse." The judge's voice grew sharper as she addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Morrison, your own testimony and the recorded evidence demonstrate a pattern of behavior toward your mother that is, frankly, shameful. You have shown more concern for your reputation than for her well-being, more interest in her assets than in her dignity. This court cannot and will not invalidate a legally executed will simply because you are unhappy with its contents." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness but of validation. For the first time in years, someone in authority had acknowledged her worth and defended her right to be treated with respect. "The plaintiff's petition is denied," Judge Hendricks concluded. "Mrs. Morrison's will shall stand as executed." As the courtroom cleared, Eleanor sat quietly in her wheelchair, processing what had just happened. She had won not just the legal case, but something much more important. She had reclaimed her dignity, her autonomy, and her right to determine her own legacy. Marcus left the courtroom without acknowledging her, his attorney beside him, already discussing an appeal. Eleanor watched him go with a mixture of sadness and relief. The little boy who had brought her dandelions was truly gone now, but she was finally free to stop mourning him outside the courthouse. Sophie pushed Eleanor's wheelchair to a small cafe where they celebrated with coffee and pastries. Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten it was there had finally been lifted. "Grandma," Sophie said, "what are you going to do now?" Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the possibilities that lay ahead. She had already started volunteering at the senior center, teaching other elderly people how to advocate for themselves. She had joined a book club and a gardening club. She had even signed up for a computer class, determined to master the internet that had seemed so intimidating before. "I'm going to live, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "I'm going to live fully and authentically, surrounded by people who value me for who I am. I'm going to make sure every day counts." Sophie squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you." Eleanor looked out the cafe window at the busy street where people were going about their lives with purpose and determination. For 3 years after her stroke, she had felt like a spectator to life, watching from the sidelines while everyone else participated. No more. At 78 years old, using a wheelchair, having just disinherited her only child, Eleanor Morrison was finally ready to begin the next chapter of her life, and for the first time in years, she couldn't wait to see what it would bring. 6 months later, Eleanor received a letter from Marcus. It was short and formal, informing her that he was appealing the court's decision and that she should direct all future communication through his attorney. There was no acknowledgement of his behavior, no apology, no indication that he had learned anything from the experience. Eleanor read the letter once, then filed it away. She had more important things to think about. She was planning a trip to Europe with Sophie after her high school graduation, the first trip Eleanor had taken since Robert's death. She was also working with the Western Massachusetts Senior Housing Initiative to establish a new program that would help elderly people remain in their homes with dignity and support. Most importantly, she had surrounded herself with people who saw her as Eleanor Morrison, not as someone's burden or problem, but as a complete person worthy of love and respect. The little boy who had brought her dandelions was gone, but the woman who had raised him was still here, still fighting, still living life on her own terms, and that, Eleanor Morrison decided, was enough.